Hello, my friends. This is Sayus, and this is the newest episode of Rambling While Drawing, or maybe Drawing While Rambling. I actually apparently haven't decided on the order of things yet, because sometimes I did it that way, sometimes the other way. Have to decide that later on. I also have apparently missed last week, and I don't have much time until Easter, so you probably have to wait a little bit for chapters 10 to 15. But for now, let's talk about My Hero Academia chapters 6 to 10. In these 5 chapters, we deal with the end of Aizawa's gym tests to evaluate Class 1A, and then after that, we have during the first day in school All Might's battle exercise, the 2 versus 2 villain versus hero exercise. So in these 5 chapters, I think I want to primarily talk about Aizawa, All Might, a bit about Bakugou, and about the tiny tidbits of the other members of the class that we meet so early on. So, chapters 6 and 7, we have a little bit more information about Aizawa, we get a little bit more about his character. In this part, we get the scene where Aizawa actually stops Deku from destroying his bones all over again, and we also get a tiny conversation between Aizawa and All Might. Now, I've already talked a little bit about Aizawa in the first video I made, chapters 1 to 5. In that, here Aizawa seems to have a different opinion to the Aizawa in Sports Festival, which I don't criticize. I don't think this is wrong that opinions can change between different arcs, especially because here Aizawa actually admits a mistake. And his mistake is that he thought the entrance exam was irrational because it let somebody like Midoriya through. He didn't give Midoriya a single chance. He made this test specifically so Midoriya would fail and he could kick Midoriya out because he didn't see any potential in him. Later on, he realized that Midoriya had potential, and by letting Midoriya in, although he doesn't admit to it in his own words, he doesn't admit that he made a mistake, by letting Midoriya in, he reevaluated his first position about Midoriya. He admitted that he made a mistake, not verbally, but at least to himself. However, it stands to reason that still, Aizawa acting the way he is might have been damaging. Aizawa didn't give Midoriya a chance, and because he didn't give Midoriya a chance, he created a test that Deku would fail, at least in Aizawa's mind. Of course, in the end, Deku didn't fail, but Deku didn't fail by very quickly, very on the top of his head, trying to think about a different way to use his quirk, which is nice, but it also gave him, at the end of the day, a wrong way to use his quirk. What we know now is that the right way to use One for All, for Deku at least, and All Might does this too, is to use the quirk on your whole body. Deku, while just using his quirk on single parts of his body, can't quite react fast enough to different scenarios. So he has to use at least some percentage of One for All on his entire body. This is the full cowling technique that he's learning with Gran Torino. And this is a necessary technique for him to learn how to fight and to use his quirk like it is his own, so he can move naturally with the quirk. And in fact, the very first way he used One for All is not quite full cowling, because he doesn't use the quirk on his whole body, but it is much closer to full cowling in the sense that he activates the quirk at much bigger parts of his own body. It stands to reason that for Deku, who just learned his quirk, it would have been much better if he had slowly tried to work up this boiling egg, or egg in a microwave metaphor, where he can use the quirk on his full body without breaking his bones. Instead, here, Deku starts focusing his quirk on just very, very small parts of his body. What happens because of that is that Deku, for a long time in the entire first season and even part through the second season, is focusing his quirk just on one part of his body, that being his hand or his finger, or maybe his arm when he really, really, really needs to in Sports Festival during his fight against Shoto. And through that he gets a lot of injuries. And maybe there's a chance that if Aizawa hadn't forced Deku to develop this method of using his quirk by just damaging a finger, Deku wouldn't have gone that far in the fight against Shoto. The thing is, Deku at this point was very, very careful and cautious about using his quirk because he knew that he would injure himself. After finding out that he can just use the quirk at singular parts of his body, he started using it more liberally. Yes, he still tried to hold back with the bigger attacks because he knew he was ruining his body like that, but he was also quite aware that he can just use his quirk on a finger or two, so especially during Sports Festival he kept breaking his fingers again and again and again and again, even though knowing he would break. If instead of relying on this method of he can just use his quirks on a finger, if instead of doing that he had focused very early on to try and use the quirk the way he later learns with Gran Torino, maybe this would have helped Deku a lot better and also let him develop without getting all these injuries that he then has in Sports Festival. Of course, this is not Aizawa's fault, as Aizawa did not know that Deku just got his quirk. But still, by pushing Midoriya into a position that Aizawa himself thought was impossible for Midoriya, he forced Midoriya to ultimately develop a way to use his quirk that was not the right way to use his quirk. In fact, I think it might have pushed Deku several steps back in how to learn his quirk, because if he had started out where he was in the beginning, which was trying to use his quirk at his full body, but just not being able to because he breaks his bones, if he had started there, he would have found full cowling much earlier on, I would argue. Instead, when he came to Gran Torino, the whole idea of moving his body naturally, of using full cowling on his whole body, was something he first had to develop because it was something that he had purposefully trained out of himself, because he was so focused on just using the quirk on the particular limb or at the most specific, smallest point that he could possibly focus his quirk on. There's part of me that thinks if maybe Aizawa in the future felt bad about not being willing to give Deku a chance so early on, that Deku had to prove himself, had to find this new method to use his quirk to make Aizawa give him a chance, instead of the other way around, Aizawa just giving him a chance and then Deku getting a chance to prove that he deserves it. Of course, factually, he gave Deku the chance to throw the ball a second time, but giving somebody the chance by telling him to do something that you think is impossible is not really giving them a chance. And I do think that Aizawa actually regrets it, because later on in chapter 277, now during the war arc, he remembers that specific scene. He remembers telling Deku that he can't be a hero. And he clearly regrets that now. It's really a bit of a heartbreaking scene, because in 277, Deku says to Shigaraki that Aizawa is the teacher who watched over all of them, and Aizawa then remembers telling Midoriya that he can't be a hero. This is really a bit heartbreaking, because it's as if Aizawa in this point thinks that he didn't really watch right, or he didn't do it correctly, that he was wrong about Midoriya, and he thinks about that in the specific moment where Midoriya tells Shigaraki that he was watching over them, that he did teach them all these things. And it's kind of heartbreaking, because we know that of course Aizawa later on changed, but Aizawa probably still remembers that part and still regrets it. Other things that are interesting about Aizawa, or that just are worth mentioning, again, because it's just very cool scenes in chapters 6 and 7, are first that he is so early on able to notice the similarities between Deku and All Might in character, that they are both reckless, and that of course the difference between All Might and Deku at this point is that All Might can back it up and Deku can't quite back it up yet, and his recklessness just puts him into danger that he can't get himself out of. Then Aizawa says to All Might that there's nothing crueler than letting someone chase their half-baked dreams. But it's interesting, not just because it comes back now, currently, with Toya's flashback, because it's somewhat of a similar story of Endeavor taking away a dream from Toya that he first placed there because he thought it was impossible. But also it's interesting because Aizawa says something very similar in the first chapter, because in the first chapter he told Midoriya that it's great to dream, but you have to be realistic about it. The really most interesting thing is that I think neither All Might nor Aizawa really reevaluated their words. They both still think that chasing a half-baked dream or chasing a dream that is unrealistic is ultimately wrong or is cruel or won't lead to happiness. They still think that. But they've changed their opinion on Midoriya. In Aizawa's case, he admitted that his initial opinion about Midoriya was wrong, and that maybe there was some potential. In All Might's case, he didn't really reevaluate his opinion on Midoriya in the sense that as a quirkless person you can't be a hero, but instead he realized that Midoriya should have the right to participate in this whole hero business, and therefore created the opportunity to become a hero and made it possible. Now, if we look at Endeavor, who said that for Toya it is impossible to reach his dream, which is to become stronger than All Might, to surpass All Might, which is also now, in a way, Deku's dream, not quite literally to become stronger than All Might, but to fill All Might's steps at least. And Endeavor thought that for Toya this dream was impossible because Toya's quirk damaged himself. He also already admitted in Endeavor Agency arc that Deku is similar to Toya, at least he admitted this, we assume that he meant this by saying that you're one of us, that he's similar to Toya in the sense that his quirk is damaging him. So if Endeavor at some point would admit that Midoriya can become the number one hero, can become as strong as All Might, despite having a quirk that can damage himself, this would again be the third instance of somebody changing their opinion, not quite on the fact that if a dream is impossible it is cruel to let you chase the dream, but rather on the factors that make a dream impossible, or the person that we assume can't fulfill a dream. We can maybe draw similar parallels with how Bakugou viewed Midoriya, in the sense that for Midoriya he couldn't be a hero because A, he was quirkless, and B, he was useless. So there's really an ongoing theme of Midoriya proving people wrong when they assessed whatever he was trying to do as impossible. And he doesn't do this by negating the initial statement of you shouldn't hunt a dream or you shouldn't chase a dream that is impossible, but rather by negating whatever factor they use to deem Midoriya unable to fulfill the dream, or to deem it impossible for Midoriya to fulfill that dream. Lastly, talking about Aizawa before we can go to the other parts of the chapters, another interesting quote for him was when he said that Japan is full of unfair things, and villains are there to correct this unfairness. This is interesting because it stands in a very stark contrast to whatever is happening now, where heroes are seen in many ways, not just by villains, but also increasingly by the society and by the reporters now during the press statement, for example, in chapter 306, but also by the fans. Increasingly, heroes are seen as the factors that create unfairness in society. We've already seen parts of this in Stain. It was kind of hinted at that there is a privilege in being a hero, which is of course fame and money and glory, and then later on in, for example, the motivation for Mr. Compress and his ancestors. This difference between Aizawa's view here of heroes existing to balance out the unfairness and to correct the unfairness, and the more current view of the war arc of heroes creating the unfairness, is a really interesting differentiation because it kind of asks the question of the chicken and the egg. Now I think I've talked enough about Aizawa, so let's quickly mention a few other interesting aspects, funny little tidbits about chapter 6 and 7. First, there's Aoyama. I talked a lot about Aoyama last chapter, surprisingly much about Aoyama last chapter. This chapter, in chapter 6, we also get Aoyama's quirk introduction. And we don't just get the quirk introduction, but we also get his scores for the 50-meter dash, both during middle school and now the score during UA during the UA test. Now, as far as I understood, because they couldn't use their quirks in middle school, as Aizawa pointed out the chapter before that, the first score that we get for Aoyama during middle school is without his quirk, and the second one is with his quirk. That explains the rather massive difference from 825 to 551. This is actually the biggest increase we see of any of the characters we get the scores for. We also get the scores for Uraraka, middle school and high school, Bakugou, middle school and high school, and Midoriya, middle school and high school. From Ida, who is very likely the fastest in the class with 304, we only get the high school scores, as far as I saw that. Of these kids, Aoyama, as mentioned, improved the most. An interesting factor is Bakugou's quirk, because I thought Bakugou would improve a lot with his quirk, but he was actually really fast even in middle school days. In middle school days he was at 5 seconds 58, and now he's at 4:13. This is especially fast when we compare it to Midoriya, who in middle school was only at 7:49, which is faster than Aoyama, sure, which is also, it's not bad, but it's a much more normal score compared to 5:58, and this is without quirk, apparently, which really seems to show that Bakugou, even without his quirk, is just amazing at everything. And of course we knew that, and I'll talk more about that later on, because we get a few flashbacks of their childhood in the upcoming chapters. But it's just striking that he is not just talented, but he's actually achieving feats here that should be impossible for any middle schooler who doesn't have or isn't allowed to use his superpowers, because 5:58 for 50-meter dash is incredible. A funny aspect I just wanted to mention, because I didn't see this coming and I didn't expect it, and I was really surprised by it, is Minato, the very first time he calls anybody sexy, it's Shoji, because he thinks octopus are sexy. And I did not see this coming. Chapter 7, we actually get the rankings after the gym tests. And I just love going through these rankings now in hindsight, that we know more about these characters and look where everybody stood at these points in time, and then think about how much Horikoshi already had these characters developed and decided specifically why which character would be at which position, especially now that we know more about their powers. Momo was number 1, which I didn't see coming, because this is a mostly physical test. Like, they were ranking speed, how fast they throw things, how much they can lift, how much they can bench press, so on and so forth. And I didn't see Momo doing all that well in these tests, but apparently she was number 1. Shoto was number 2. I just assumed that Horikoshi put these two up there because they were the recommended students, and he just wanted to hype them up a little bit for the future introduction. At this point, both of them, we already saw them, but we didn't really were introduced to them yet. Then Bakugou is number 3, who I thought would be a little bit higher, because he is physically strong and he is good at everything, and his quirk would also have helped him with quite a few of these disciplines. Then we have Ida, Tokoyami, and Shoji, which I think makes all sense, because Ida, of course, gets points whenever there's speed involved. Tokoyami, Dark Shadow, can probably do everything for him, and Shoji is just strong, so he gets points at all these strength tests. Ojiro probably also makes sense, because his tail is very strong, and he's physically strong too, and he also is a martial artist, so maybe that helps. Koda, I didn't think would be that high, because Koda, I didn't see any physical feats yet. At least I don't remember them. Maybe through reading through the manga I will find a few more here and there. But I didn't think Koda was physically strong or very fast. He didn't show anything in this regard. I don't know if he could have, if the animals could have helped him in any of the disciplines. I didn't see him that high. Sato, I thought, would have ranked higher, because a lot of strength tests were involved in this exam, and he should do well in all of these. Tsuyu makes sense. Aoyama makes probably sense, because he can use his quirk quite niftily. Then we have Sero, Kaminari, Jiro, and Hagakure. I'm a bit surprised about Hagakure, because Hagakure's quirk just doesn't help her at all with any of these disciplines that I saw. At least there was no hiding discipline, as far as I could tell. Jiro, I don't know if her quirk could have helped her, maybe. But Hagakure I thought was lower, especially because we saw Mineta do really, really well on one of the later tests. There was a sidestepping thing where Mineta was apparently really, really good at. But this didn't help him get very high, because he still is second lowest. And I'm just very surprised, because I don't know which discipline Hagakure or Jiro or even Kaminari would have made enough points in to make more points at the end than Mineta and Izuku, who both have at least a discipline where they were really, really good at. Anyway, this is just musing for funsies, because I really, really like looking at these rankings now that we know more about the characters, and both think about A, what Horikoshi had maybe planned with these characters so early on, and B, how well they improved. There are 3 other funny tidbits in Chapter 7. One is that Midoriya is the only one who listens to Mike, to present Mike in class, in English class. 2, I just love these little fourth wall breaks when the students say that All Might is drawn so differently from them. There are a few of those in the manga, and I always love about them. And 3, we have an actual indirect hint that Recovery Girl can kill with her quirk by draining people out of their stamina. Now, chapters 8, 9, 10, we get into the hero versus villains 2v2 battle exercise. And I want to start this by talking a little bit about All Might's teaching style. There are a few things I thought really interesting, and a few things that came back in the manga a few times. The first thing is that All Might is clearly a learning by doing teacher. We can see this very early on already here in chapter 8, sorry. And this is something that he still struggles with much later on in My Hero Academia, where he first has to learn how to actually be a hero, because to him it all came naturally. So here he's also still very much just learning by doing. He just assumes it will come naturally. He seems to be very confident, though, in his teaching, which I find funny, because at this point he has no clue whatsoever how to be a teacher, and he will have to spend the next few chapters and arcs and basically the entire manga to learn how to be a teacher, and still he comes into the class brazen and full of confidence. However, despite being so confident, he still has to read his scenario for the battle exercise from a cheat sheet, which is kind of funny. What also is funny is that he is really encouraging his student to really, really get into this villain role, which reminds me of the students versus teachers exam when he fought Bakugou and Deku, where he really, really got into the villain role. And I just love that All Might seems to have a knack for roleplay. Like, he just always wanted to be a villain, and he just wants his students to act like they are villains. It's just funny. Now, All Might, during basically the entire chapter 10, really struggles with the idea that he decided to not treat Deku differently to his other students, because Deku now is just a student, and he knows that Deku wouldn't appreciate the favoritism. But he also really wants to give Deku the chances to prove himself, and he wants to give Deku the chances to grow. And he knows that for Deku it is important to fight Bakugou. So in this case, he does show kind of favoritism towards Deku, because he knows Deku a lot better than the others, and he knows what Deku wants, and he knows to give Deku chances, even when he knows as a teacher he should stop the fight between Deku and Bakugou. This is one of his major struggles during the entire chapter 10, because he's thinking about stopping this fight several times throughout the chapter, and yet he doesn't. And just before he decides to stop it after all, the battle actually ends, so he doesn't ever stop the fight. On top of that, Midoriya also told All Might a lot about Bakugou. He apparently told him about the bullying. So All Might goes into this with a rather unfavorable opinion about Bakugou, rightfully so, and thinks of him as rather conceited and kind of a bad guy. He still, despite having this very bad first opinion on Bakugou that he goes in with, he still is able to recognize that Bakugou is intelligent, and that Bakugou did still, despite being clearly angry and being a bit unhinged and being a bully, able to hold himself back just enough to not hurt anybody. Or not hurt anybody seriously. It's not just interesting in this chapter to follow how his thought process on Midoriya and how it is important for Midoriya to face his bully in this scene, but also how he thinks about Bakugou, and that he goes into this scene with a rather negative opinion about Bakugou, and still, despite having this negative opinion about Bakugou, he's able to make the distinction and realize that Bakugou is actually fairly smart and does kind of hold himself back and seems to be able to make these important decisions that allow him to continue the fight. However, still, what stands is that All Might comes into this arc saying he can't favor Deku, and he comes out of this arc saying, I should have acted different as a teacher, but I had to give Deku the chance to deal with it himself, which wasn't necessarily the safe option. Now, before I want to talk about Bakugou, I want to talk about a few other aspects about chapters 8 to 10, the other smaller, funny, curious, interesting little parts. First, there is the hero costume design panel, where we got one panel where several characters' hero costume sheets are shown, where they get to design their costumes. The most interesting thing here, or for me the funniest thing, was Mineta, because Mineta really only wanted a cape. One thing I was really curious about is if these little drawings that are always on the sheet, if the students draw them themselves so they can give a bit of a design idea for the costume, or if these are pre-printed design ideas by the school or by somebody from support or wherever. Because Mineta's page shows them at normal height. And I kind of want to know if he drew himself that way, or if that was just the design that was already on the page, that they had like a mannequin and he just drew the general design idea on there. I wanted to quickly mention that Uraraka took the battle exercise, a lot less serious than the gym tests, which is of course a given because there is no threat of being expelled, but I just thought it was cool that Horikoshi put this panel in there, because it showed that what Aizawa wanted to achieve, that these kids really take this test seriously, he actually managed to do in the exam before. Another interesting aspect is that these different teams that were created for the battle exercise, there were a few teams among them which don't seem quite coincidental. It seems to me like Horikoshi likes to put several characters up together every now and then. And there are a few teams, even as early as now chapter 8, where we can clearly see that he likes to put these characters together. There's Kaminari and Jiro who are together, Deku and Uraraka are of course not coincidental, Tokoyami and Froppy are a team he likes to put together, and even Mina and Aoyama, they meet each other together in, for example, the sports festival. Deku and Froppy, of course, Tokoyami and Froppy, of course, also work together during the students versus teachers exams later on in the school year. Chapter 9, I found out that apparently in Japan you have uniforms as early as kindergarten, because by the time that Deku learned about not having a quirk or being quirkless, he was, I assume that has to be kindergarten or preschool and isn't elementary school, but they are wearing uniforms and I hate these uniforms, they're looking like tents. Chapter 9, another funny tidbit is that Aoyama gets his character introduction page, and I just love following this development of Aoyama where Horikoshi just puts him in everything, because after noticing it in the first video, apparently it's an aspect here again. Aoyama is, after Bakugou, Deku, Ida, and Uraraka, the 5th character in 1A who gets his own character introduction page, and the page is essentially empty. There's not a single necessary information or useful information on this page apart from his birthday and the fact that he likes himself. Chapter 10 gives us a bit of a tidbit on Ida's character. Ida in this chapter goes completely into playing this villain persona. He seems to maybe even rather enjoy it, but first and foremost he really takes the assignment seriously, so he really gets into the role-playing role. However, despite playing the villain, he not once attacks Uraraka. He prepares the whole area around the bomb in a way that Uraraka can't use things that are lying around against him, but he doesn't attack her. He seems determined to just run down the clock, which seems a rather inconvenient strategy for him. And I don't just say this because ultimately it fails, but also because for him there is no reason to assume that it would work out. Yes, he has Bakugou fighting Deku, but he doesn't know how this fight will end. If he's unlucky and Deku wins, then ultimately he will face Deku and Uraraka together. Now he has Uraraka alone, which is probably his best chance to take Uraraka out. Sure, these quirks, his engine and her zero gravity, don't really complement each other, but it's not like he has no chance against her. I think he has a good chance against her. In all the prior tests they had, and he saw the scores, he always ranked above her, so he has every reason to assume that he can defeat her in a 1v1. But he doesn't even try, and if he had tried, if he had taken Uraraka out, then even with whatever is happening with Deku and Bakugou, they would have won the assignment. And this seems even more risky for Ida, because Ida is one of the few people who really sees the potential in Midoriya. After the entrance exam, Ida thought that Midoriya was smart enough or aware enough that he understood the real purpose of the entrance exams. He is one of the characters who actually saw the full potential of Deku's quirk. Yes, he also saw that Deku damaged himself, but something we see throughout these last few chapters, these last five to six chapters, is that he was always waiting for Deku to use his quirk. He always knew that Deku has this great quirk, and he's really seeing the potential in Deku. So there's no reason for Ida, even knowing what he does about Bakugou's talent, to assume that Bakugou will win in any case. And Ida even knows that there's something going on with Bakugou, that Bakugou is more emotional than he normally is, and is acting in a way that is rather inconvenient for him. And yet still he doesn't decide to use this as a reason to change his maybe more way to turn down the clock type strategy to a more aggressive, well, if Bakugou isn't working with me, then I have to take Uraraka down to make sure that we win anyway. I always thought that this is because Ida had decided on this running down the clock strategy and thought that for whatever reason fighting Uraraka is maybe too risky, and he just has to stand between her and the bomb, and that's what he does. However, now that I have read the whole story, and I have read among others chapter 35 during Sports Festival, when Ida says to Deku that Bakugou probably won't fight with his whole explosive power against a female opponent, I have changed my opinion a little bit. The reason Ida didn't fight Uraraka maybe wasn't because he thought running down the clock is the smartest strategy, but rather because he just didn't want to fight a woman. But now, let's finally talk about Bakugou. A few interesting things about Bakugou. First, there are some very, very just out there things that are interesting little aspects. I, for example, really annoyed that he's one of these kids that wears the trousers low slung. Just annoyed at that. That's something we find out in his UA files. I also thought it was funny or interesting that even in the UA files already in chapter 10, Horikoshi mentions that in winter he starts kind of slow. And I think the first time Bakugou actually talked about this in the story was in Endeavor Agency arc. So this is really just an interesting aspect where Horikoshi introduced this weakness so early on with the UA files. But didn't actually use this part in the story up until much later. Now let's talk about Bakugou during the whole fight. It's clear that Bakugou is very angry. We know now that he's very intelligent, and even in chapter 10 it's told right away that he is instinctually great at everything, and he knows how to make great decisions in the middle of the battle without having to think much about it. And yet in chapter 9 he makes horrible decisions of just running around doing his own things without actually talking to his partner about it. I love just comparing this Bakugou to the Bakugou that we have now in the current manga as it is after the war arc, where he is able to work with others. This Bakugou is completely unable to work with Ida. He doesn't consider Ida's opinion at all. Ida specifically asks him not to just run straight at Midoriya, and it's the first thing Bakugou does without even explaining himself to Ida and without caring much about what Ida thinks at any point in this fight. Bakugou has shown as early as Sports Festival that he is able to utilize other people's quirks to his advantage. And I think he probably is able to do this even at this point. I think this is something Bakugou is just intelligent enough to be able to do that. But I also think that, at least at this point in the story, he saw other people as means to an end, as tools to achieve whatever he wanted to achieve. In Sports Festival, that works out because they all want the same and they are all just agreeing on following Bakugou's command. Here, it doesn't quite work out because Ida and Bakugou are they're not really quarreling over power, of course, because they never really talk to each other about the fact. But it's not like Ida is just willing to do whatever Bakugou wants him to do. Ida comes in with his own ideas about how this fight would go. And secondly, because Bakugou succeeding during this exercise isn't just his primary goal. Bakugou wants to succeed in the exercise, of course he wants to win, but he also really wants to show Midoriya that he's still stronger, which is something Ida couldn't care less about. So they don't have the same goals, and therefore they don't work together. And Bakugou also doesn't think he needs Ida. He wants to show Midoriya that he's stronger all by himself. So Bakugou here couldn't care less about his partner. And in Sports Festival, he still does probably not care much about his partners during the cavalry battle, but he's willing to accept their help because they are tools for him. However, with Remedial Course, and a bit before that, but most strikingly with Remedial Course and then later during the joint training arc, Bakugou really learns how to work with others and consider them not just as tools, but to even respect them and to work with them and not just use them. Of course, Chapter 10 is also the chapter where we get Bakugou's flashback. And I really appreciate the fact that I finally reread the flashback. Because I remember the first time, and this is a flashback I only watched in the anime, the first time I watched this, I understood where Bakugou came from, but I also thought it was just very petty and very exaggerated. And I wasn't a big fan of it, overall. I liked Bakugou as a character, I thought it was interesting enough, but the flashback I thought was really underwhelming as a motivation for why he is the way he is. Reading it now, to me, it made really a lot of sense, and I started really appreciating basically the simplicity of how he became the way he became. Bakugou is a character who all his life was told by everybody that he is awesome. And on top of just being told by everybody, he is also just talented at a lot of things. Everything he tries, he succeeds at. And this is something where even when he compares himself with his peers and classmates and people his age, he's always the best at everything. He can skip stones better than everybody else. His quirk is more amazing than everybody else's. We've just before in this video talked about how fast he is even without his quirk. So physically, he seems to be superior to a lot of other people his age. Bakugou really is amazing, and in this sense, Deku is correct. He's not an amazing person as a human being, to say it like that, but in terms of talent, he's amazing at everything he tries. And this is something Bakugou, of course, as a kid noticed. And he would have noticed it if other people told him or not, but the fact that other people told him that made it even worse. He built up this great confidence that he is over everybody else. And Deku, Midoriya, of course, is basically just the opposite. Midoriya is bad at everything. We saw his middle school run score, which isn't terrible, but it isn't the best ever, and it's rather average, really. We saw him in this flashback not being able to skip stones at all, and then he turns out doesn't have a quirk at all. One of the only people, probably his age, who doesn't have a quirk, because less and less people are born quirkless. And I always understood that this confidence and the admiration that he got from everybody else around him, with everybody following him, with all his friends being ultimately just his followers, realistically, I always understood that this would build up his arrogance, and that because he's so arrogant, he would then easily turn into a bully. But I think something I only really understood now, or maybe I understood it before, but became very much more aware of it now, is the vulnerability of this position that he was as a child. Bakugou is awesome. Bakugou is admired by everybody. All of his friends, all of their friends, see him as their leader. Bakugou is the one who will be a hero. Bakugou is the one who may be stronger than All Might one day. He always thought these things, and he was in many ways taught these things, and many of the people around him seem to believe these things, but they are only true for as long as Bakugou really is awesome. And especially when he started viewing everybody else as just pedals on the road, something he absolutely cannot afford is to just become one of them. So when he falls into the lake, he has to brush it off. He has to just act as if he's fine, and he has to believe himself that he's fine, that he can stand up from it himself, and that he doesn't need any help. And when he's then offered help, he realizes that other people don't see him that way, or his other friends see him that way. His other friends seem perfectly convinced that he doesn't need help, but Midoriya doesn't see him that way. And if Midoriya doesn't see him that way, maybe other people don't see him that way either. Maybe he's not that. Maybe he needs help. And if he needs help, then he's just anybody. And if he's just anybody, then he can't be all these things that he sees himself at. And then all this admiration will be gone because he ends up not being awesome. It's not just annoyance that Midoriya, this pebble on the road, will rise up to dare to defy him and dare to act as if he is just as good as Bakugou. But it's also in a way the fear that if Midoriya can rise up to be just like Bakugou, then anybody can rise up to be just like Bakugou. The fear that if the least of them, Midoriya, who is useless, if even he can become just like Bakugou, then Bakugou is just normal, and all this admiration and adoration, and he's not amazing, and it will all be gone. And he doesn't get any of it, and he's just one of many, and he seems to be really afraid of that, and this is something that causes all of this anger. And in this fight, in this battle rescue, then in the present, when he's getting into UA, and when he finds out that useless Deku may actually have a quirk, and may have an amazing quirk that is really, really powerful, and may even be so arrogant that he didn't show Bakugou this quirk. That Bakugou was arrogant and bragging about his quirk. Midoriya was just silently snickering about, haha, I have a quirk too, and it's so amazing, and you don't know, you just think you're cooler. This is something he just gets angry at, and he gets so angry at it because he's ultimately afraid that he's just a normal guy, and this is the first and kind of most brutal lesson he has to learn in UA, and it's really striking that, in a way, learning that he is just another kid and not amazing, and or at least not more amazing than everybody else, and that there are kids like Shoto, for example, who have just awesome quirks, who are more powerful than him at this stage. To learn this for him is in a way more devastating than to be kidnapped. The only reason why being kidnapped was devastating for him was because All Might ended up being losing his power because of that. If that hadn't happened, he would have just brushed it off in many ways. But the fact that there are kids who are as old as him, but better than him, that's something he couldn't deal with. So I really appreciate the fact that I finally reread this chapter, because while it didn't really make me understand Bakugou finally, because I understood him before, it actually helped me understand or remember this vulnerability that he had early on a lot better. And on top of that, it did one other thing for me, and that is just appreciate Horikoshi's writing and how he develops different characters. Something I was always a little bit frustrated by regarding Bakugou's character is that I never really saw him fight that much. For somebody who is like so strong and who has this great potential as a hero and who is a top student in his class in many ways, I just want to see him fight sometimes, and we don't really get to see much in that regard. We don't get to see him fight a lot during the USJ attack, even though at this point he's one of the very few established characters. We don't get to see him do much. He doesn't get to fight during Hosu arc because he's not there. He doesn't get to do much during the forest training camp because there's this danger that he might burn down the forest and then he's kidnapped. In Kamino Ward, even though he's there, he just has to avoid fighting in many ways and then he runs away. He fails his provisional license, which means he doesn't get an internship, and even in his first internship he apparently didn't see much action as far as we can tell. Then he, of course, fails provisional license. He doesn't get to go into the internship. He's again absent during overhaul because he doesn't have a provisional license. He doesn't do anything against Gentle. He's not involved in that. And now, even in the even in Endeavor Agency arc, he isn't the one fighting Ending. That he is the one rescuing Natsuo, and he also. I mean, even in provisional in the Paranormal Liberation War arc, which is I think the one time where he is the most involved in actual fighting, he's not the one who does the most fighting. He sacrifices himself at one point, and then he gets certain bits and pieces of fighting here and there. But he's also the one who at some point takes back a step and lets Deku fight alone while preparing Endeavor to help with an attack instead of fighting himself. Which is very interesting because he's one of the most physically powerful characters in Class 1A, with one of the most powerful and flashy quirks, who would be a powerhouse to deal with for every villain, and yet he doesn't really get that many fights. He would have been a great help anywhere, but he isn't really there much. He does, however, get a lot of interesting fights during school. However, even then, quite often, the fighting aspects aren't really the interesting parts. His character arc is never about proving that he can fight, or learning how to fight, or learning better ways to use his quirk. These are things that happen in the background because we just assume he's awesome and he's gonna be able to deal with his quirk, and his quirk is amazing, and we know that. I mean, we don't really need to see him develop new tricks because he's great. Of course, he's gonna develop new tricks. If Ida and Aoyama and Deku can develop new tricks, of course Bakugou can develop new tricks. We don't need to see that. When we see him fight, the struggles are more so personal. It's not because he's afraid to fight, it's not because he has a strong opponent, it's not because he wants to show off a new technique or wants to get past some fear that he has or something that's holding him back. It's because he has to learn something in his character, because he has to learn how to cooperate, because he has to learn how to take people seriously, because he has to learn how to save people. These are all lessons that are much more important to him, and that is why Horikoshi in his writing never focuses on showing Bakugou during great battle scenes. He focuses on showing Bakugou just in school, being able to work with his classmates during just normal assignments, or during, for example, being willing to play the drummer in this class band. That's a good character moment for him. Or in Remedial Course arc, when he's dealing with children. This is a character moment for him that is probably more important than a lot of the fighting that he does here and there, because this is where he has to grow. Bakugou's journey is not about becoming a hero in the sense that he has to be strong and he has to learn how to use his superpower and he has to learn all these tricks how to help people. Bakugou's journey is about being able to care about other people, about seeing himself as one of many, about being able to realize that there are people that may be stronger than him, and then to, instead of being angry because of that, to see it as a motivation to be stronger himself. It's about learning how to be cooperative, how to save people, how to view others not just as tools, but as people. That's what Bakugou's journey is about, and that's why he doesn't need to be there in all these action scenes. He needs to be there in the school scenes, where it's actually all these slice of life stuff, because that's where he can learn that. He can't learn all that when he's fighting, I don't know, Gentle or Stain. That wouldn't help him at all. And I really like how Horikoshi knows this and therefore manages to focus Bakugou's arc on where it matters. And he does the same with Shoto. Shoto has a bit more action scenes. He's like involved in Hosu. He doesn't get to do a fighting in Kamino Ward, but he at least involves himself purposefully in Kamino Ward. And he also is the one who actually gets to take down Ending, for example. So Shoto gets a little bit more fighting, but for him too, his development isn't about growing how to fight. It's about learning how to use his quirk and how to actually see his quirk as his own, which is why it's important to show him fight here and there, because we need to see him develop his quirk usage, which is something we don't need for Bakugou. But it's much more so about learning how to mature into being himself, learning how to live with what happened in his past, learning to live with whatever is happening with his family, learning to maybe make up with his family and to rekindle a relationship with his mother. These are the important things for his character. It's not important that he has a powerful quirk. We know that. He's probably gonna be a powerful hero. We know that. We don't really need to see him pummel all kinds of villains all the time. However, with Deku, for example, we have to see him fight villains, because he is somebody who is actually afraid of, for example, hurting people. He is somebody who lives for saving people. He is somebody who has to develop confidence and be able to stand up to people. And he's somebody who has to be able to control his quirk and find different ways to use his quirk, because it's all new. So we have to see these different things with Deku. So we get a lot of action with Deku, while he maybe in many ways takes a back seat during the school scenes, because in this sense Bakugou is maybe more important there. And I just like that Horikoshi knows where to focus these characters on. Bakugou is important everywhere, of course, because he's the main character, but there are still things where we have to focus more on... Deku. Deku is the main character. Well, I'm so tired, I think we should end the video here. I said everything I want to say anyway. So thank you for watching. Tune in the next time, which will be... maybe I'll make 10 chapters next video, because I can't do much in the next 3 to 4 weeks. So I have a lot of time to deal with to actually summarize 10 chapters. Tune in the next time, whenever that is. Tell me what you thought about these these 5 chapters, or the early 10 chapters. All of them, to be honest. You can also talk to me about the current chapter. I loved the current chapter 306. I even thought about making a video about that instead of this one. But I would have just used that as an excuse to find more about Endeavor, and I can't keep doing that. So, yeah, time to end the video. See ya.